Welcome to our third lecture in the Chautauqua series. Thank you all for being here, and special thanks to our generous sponsor, Wells Fargo Advisors. Thank you, Kevin and Marion. Our Pulitzer Prize anniversary celebration has thus far dealt with two very different topics: the life of Eugene O'Neill, an early winner of 4 Pulitzer Prizes for drama, and the experiences of a living prize winner, Hank Klebanoff, whose 35-year career in journalism was closely associated with perhaps the major national topic of the last century, civil rights. Tonight, we step back from the prizes and look at the complex man who founded them, a man who so enjoyed coming to the Jekyll Island Club that he owned a cottage there. I was happy to have an excuse to invite James McGrath Morris here to speak about Joseph Pulitzer. When Mr. Morris's biography of Pulitzer was published in 2010, my mother, who loved American biographies with a passion, bought the book, read it, and passed it on to me with an enthusiastic recommendation. The Wall Street Journal named it one of the best books on American moguls, one of the 5 best books on American moguls, and Booklist placed it on its annual list of the 10 best biographies. Like my mother, Mr. Morris has a passion for biographies. He's a founder and former president of Biographers International Organization, the world's only literary association devoted to biographers and biography. Mr. Morris's most recent work is the New York Times bestseller, Eye on the Struggle, Ethel Payne, the First Lady of the Black Press, which tells the story of this groundbreaking journalist. She worked for the Chicago Defender. You may remember that Hank Klebanoff spoke about the Chicago Defender last week, and it was founded by a St. Simon's native, Robert Abbott. Mr. Morris's next book, The Ambulance Drivers, is scheduled for publication in April 2017 and will describe the friendship between Ernest Hemingway and John Dos Passos. Mr. Morris grew up in Washington, Paris, and Brussels. He holds a bachelor's from American University and a master's from George Washington University. Prior to becoming a full-time writer, he spent a decade as a journalist, a decade working in the book and magazine business, and a decade as a high school teacher. An interesting addition to his resume is his trip to northern Spain this summer. He and his wife spent 41 days walking the ancient 500-mile pilgrimage trail, Camino de Santiago. Mr. Morris, thank you very much for sharing with us the story of Joseph Pulitzer.
You know, thank you, Mimi. When somebody says so many nice things about me, I wish my parents were alive. I was the black sheep of the family. And my aunt used to point out when 10 years and that, 10 years and that, when, Jamie, are you going to grow up and get a real job? Still haven't. If we'd had a gathering like this, let's say a century or so ago, we might have gone out of this building afterwards and looked out on the waters and seen 2 of the remarkable yachts to go by. Corsair, owned by J.P. Morgan, and Liberty, owned by Joseph Pulitzer. And as the 2 men knew, Liberty was a foot shorter than J.P. Morgan's boat. But the men who gathered here, and I say men because women, as you know, were so excluded. Kate Pulitzer, who could have been a very successful woman on her own, would have been thwarted in every way. So the men that gathered here in these waters were reshaping America in a way that it's still reshaped by them today. Carnegie gave us the steel that made the buildings possible. Rockefeller, for instance, the fuel that powers our cars. Morgan, the financial system that our American system is built upon. And Joseph Pulitzer gave us the modern mass media. But he's little remembered for that because he made a fatal flaw, and any of you who have money, keep this in mind. When you endow a prize, everybody remembers the prize, but few people remember what you did. When I started this book, people said, oh, Pulitzer, right, that's a prize, right? What else did he do? It's the same with Alfred Nobel. Well, my aim tonight is to give you a kind of Baedeker's guide to Joseph Pulitzer's life and tell you about his significant contributions to the American mass media and the creation of it. Like many men of the 19th century, he began his life elsewhere in a small part of Hungary near the Romanian border in a town called Bacău. He was part of a Jewish family on the very outskirts of civilization then. This is one of the only existing photographs from that time. And fascinatingly, I discovered, and the focus may not be good enough, but the little store name in the far right, I Googled it and discovered that it was a confectionery company in Brooklyn, and I sent them the photograph, and they were astonished to see a photograph of the great-great-grandparents' business. So Pulitzer wasn't alone in finding the New World a place. He came to the United States under very unusual circumstances. The Civil War was underway, or as others might want to call it, the War of Northern Aggression. And the North had this draft. And the problem with the draft was the war continued, and people stopped wanting to go off to the war. And you could get out of the war, like Morgan did, by writing a $300 check, but the community still had to produce an able body to go off to war. Boston had this brilliant idea. Let's send a recruiter to Europe and find young single men and bring them over to serve essentially as mercenaries. So they did that for a while, but they discovered that as they came to the United States, other recruiters grabbed them. So they finally had a shipload coming over that Joseph Pulitzer signed up to leave Hungary. Now his upbringing in Hungary, he was one of about 4 or 5, it's been a few years, maybe 6 children, 2 of which survived past the age of 13. The economic life in Hungary was not promising. The collapse of the 1848 revolution had left little hope for young men like him. So the United States offered hope, and these folks offered a passage, and he came to the United States and arrived in Boston. He did jump ship, literally, and went to New York, where he got a better bounty for joining the military. And this is a photograph that shows what was going on at City Hall Park in front of what will become Park Row. I want you to remember this because this is a place that will become significant later in his life. So he joined the Northern armies in a tent like this and became a member of the Union Army. Now he did something unusual with the bits of money he had. This is his mother, by the way, and his sister. His sister, a few years after this picture was taken, was deceased. But his mother was a widow and remained back in Hungary. She remarried before Pulitzer left, and he had a stepfather. Again, another reason to leave. He did not like his stepfather. So he does something really interesting, the kind of thing that excites somebody like me doing research. I discovered in the Library of Congress in a file folder the object you're looking at. I placed a dime to give you a sense of how small it was. This is a gold dollar from back then. He was given a gold dollar. Now, if you've ever read Dickens or some of those books, you sometimes hear about people sewing money into their clothes. Well, when that much money is that small, you would sew your money into the clothes to make sure it's not lost. So Pulitzer got the thing and took it to a jeweler in New York and had his mother's initials inscribed on the back. If you want deep psychological thinking, he did not use her current married name, but a previous name. And he sent it to her. And this object is what the Hungarian women of taste used. My grandmother used to keep a handkerchief tucked under her sleeve. Well, you had a little bit of jewelry to go with it, and that's what it was. The significance of it is that he sent it to his mother back in Hungary. It's the equivalent of a tweet today or Instagram, "Mom, I'm okay, I made it in the New World." How did this come to be in the Library of Congress? After World War II, when Hungary was occupied by the Soviet troops and conditions were awful, Hungarians began writing to their famous cousins, the Pulitzers in the United States, asking for care packages. And that generation of Pulitzers dispatched a lawyer to Hungary to find out which of these are really, truly relatives. See, like most Jews in Eastern Europe, his family didn't originally have a last name. When they took it on, it was from the town of Pulitz. Pulitzer is somebody from town Pulitz. So he wasn't alone in having that name. And one of the families provided this, which is obviously proof that they were connected, and it sits in a file folder in the Library of Congress today. So he went off and served in the Shenandoah Valley. I'd like to tell you he served with great distinction, but basically he played chess in a camp. He was a very good chess player. He was also had very poor eyesight, so I'm not sure I'd want him taking shots at anyone. But after the war, a remarkable moment occurred to him. He was part of the procession down Pennsylvania Avenue at the end of the war, and he was in the cavalry. And what I find so astounding about this is that they gathered originally up at the U.S. Capitol. The dome was brand new then. And so he gathered in the morning in the shadow of the dome of the U.S. Capitol. What is so striking about the U.S. Capitol, and what we as Americans often forget, is its architecture of democracy. It is a building built specifically to house two chambers, one of which can be occupied only by people who have been elected. Nobody in the House can ever be appointed to the House. You have to be elected. And he came from a country which had nothing but imperial buildings that used to support the notion of kings. So I love this idea of this man who is now beginning to become intoxicated with democracy in a small d, for a brief moment being in the shadow of this building before engaging in this march. However, the economic life in the United States right after the Civil War was not much different than many countries after the war. There wasn't much employment to reabsorb all these men. So he went to New York looking for work. He was slept as an indigent on a park bench back at the park where he was recruited. He went into French's Hotel right there at the park, but they threw him out because he was, a bum, basically. And what he did is he took his last few dimes to go to St. Louis. Now, he never told us exactly why he went to St. Louis, but it's pretty easy to figure out. Despite the name Saint Louis or St. Louis, it was really a German-settled town. There were parts of St. Louis where there was a daily paper published in German, bars with German names, German food. What's the connection? Well, in Hungary, you had to learn German in school after the failure of the 1848 revolution. So he spoke German. So his emigration to St. Louis is not that much different than a Latino trying to find a community in the United States where Spanish could be used. He went to St. Louis, and it worked. He found jobs there of all sorts, including being a waiter in a restaurant and all these varieties of things. But he became befriended by this man, Carl Schurz, one of the most famous emigres after the failure of the 1848 revolution from Germany. He was working as an editor for the Westlich Post, and excuse my pronunciation, German is not a strong suit of mine. And Pulitzer ended up, and I'm shortening the story, but you can read the 500-page book, becoming a reporter on the Westlich Post. Now, it's an unusual newspaper, and I'll tell you more about it in a second. Ooh, I'm sorry, am I near something? Oh. But he became a member of a group of people who were interested in reforming democracy at this point. And they carried an unusual name that may sound oxymoronic today, but bear with me, liberal Republicans. So let me tell you about them. Missouri, like a lot of states, had disenfranchised all Democrats after the Civil War, and they had a loyalty oath. And if you wanted to vote in Missouri and had been a Democrat, you had to sign a loyalty oath that said, if you or your cousin 5 times removed had said something nice about the Confederacy, forget about voting. So the only people who could vote in Missouri at that point were Republicans, who now controlled the state government, and African Americans who had been enfranchised by the 15th Amendment. But Democrats could not vote, basically. And Republicans were taking advantage of the situation. There was an enormous amount of corruption. So liberal Republicans were running on the notion of cleaning up the government, particularly in St. Louis. And I'll tell you a story about St. Louis in a second. So these are all the cast of characters, and there are lots of cartoons from that period. Joseph Pulitzer was unusually tall, so Grosvenor and others are with him. And I'll show you another cartoon that I love. Joseph Kepler was Thomas Nast's rival, and if Thomas Nast had not lived, we'd all know about his work. And when he got bored, he loved to do cartoons of Pulitzer. Even this scene in a restaurant, Pulitzer is over here. Pulitzer's not yet known by anyone. He just shows up in these drawings. I think this is a veiled reference to a story that Pulitzer, associated with Pulitzer. When he worked as a waiter in a restaurant, he dropped a tray of food in somebody's lap, and then he berated the customer. Tells you a lot about his temperament. So let's get back to this reform movement. So Pulitzer is part of this newspaper that's moving to reform the state government. It's a German paper published in German. And the newspaper business back then was not like it is today. The 2 major papers in St. Louis was the Missouri Democrat and the Missouri Republican. They had no advertising, and they were sustained by political contributions from the parties. And when the party won power, all the printing contracts went to that newspaper. So there was no such thing as independent press back then. And this reform movement was geared up to change state government in this atmosphere. Pulitzer, on this date, was covering a meeting of the liberal Republicans in a particular ward in St. Louis. He left to go to the bathroom, and when he came back in, he found he'd been nominated to fill out the term of somebody who had resigned. Again, Republicans are the only ones who can win, so he was elected, and he went to Jefferson City, Missouri. 1869. He's been in the United States for 5 years. He's gotten his citizenship by a slight little bit of craftiness. He said he'd been in the U.S. long enough. He hadn't been. He'd also lied about his age to serve in the Union Army. He didn't seem to mind fudging the truth a little bit, which is going to be ironic when you realize what role he's going to go into as a newspaper publisher. But what we fail to remember about the United States at this time is this kind of place is the center of lawmaking. Washington was this little swamp-infested place in the East Coast that never made any laws that governed people. Sure, it sent us off to war and had some currency issues, but things governing education, crime, sex, whatever that's important to you were made in places like this. What an intoxicating moment for a new immigrant to be elected to those chambers with farmers and lawyers making the laws for that part of the United States. He became a religious zealot about democracy with a small d. I mean, it was an astonishing moment for him. It was also a dangerous moment for him. Turns out that this heavy-set man was a contractor in St. Louis. Augustine was his name. And he was making money hands over, just money by the buckets, having all these corrupt contracts with the county government. And Pulitzer was aiming to put an end to this. And what I mean by contracts, for instance, he was in charge of digging the well for the new insane asylum that was being built in St. Louis. If you know anything about you have so much water here, you probably don't have these things, but I live in Santa Fe, so wells is something we know a lot about. He kept digging and digging, claiming he hadn't struck water. Of course, he's being paid by every foot that he dug. He dug the second deepest well in the world at this point. Belgium's was deeper, and being paid for it. Interestingly enough, Pulitzer, as a reporter for Westlake Post, was beginning to learn the power of language, and he called it the Well of Fools. Fools, of course, being a word that people used for people who had mental issues in that time. So he's beginning to do that, and he was also learning something very powerful, that humor is particularly destructive of politicians. Sarah Palin, Dan Quayle, even if you like them, they lost their credibility once they become the subject of late-night humor. Pulitzer was learning this too. So Augustine was not a happy man. He came to Jefferson City to take up a fight with Pulitzer. And they were at the hotel, and Pulitzer called him a pup. Doesn't sound too nasty. In fact, I can say it in public today. That's a term that was considered so vile it was an invitation to a duel. So Pulitzer went back to his hotel room to get his gun. Yes, legislators in the 1870s seemed to pack heat. And he came back to this hotel, and they were so angry at each other, Pulitzer raised his gun and took 2 shots. Now, I don't want to cast aspersions on the American military, but both shots missed this 250-pound man and only grazed him in the arm. And he came over and knocked Pulitzer down. Pulitzer claimed that Augustine had brass knuckles, but anyway. Pulitzer was indicted for assault, but it all got swept under the carpet. And in fact, to give you a sense of the times back then, Pulitzer shortly thereafter was appointed to the St. Louis Police Commission. But let me get back to the better parts of Joseph Pulitzer. As an elected member of the state legislature, he worked to re-enfranchise those Democrats. Understand what that means. He worked to put back on the voters' rolls the people who would immediately vote him out of office, which is what happened. He succeeded, and in the election, this is a cartoon showing how the whole platform is being, and there he is, being knocked off. And so the Republican, liberal Republican movement came to an end in that sense in Missouri, but not nationally. Again, more cartoons of him carrying on that Republican reform movement. And of course, they made the mistake of nominating Horace Greeley, if you remember the name, who, if you think they're funny candidates running for president, I'm not casting any notions, I just wanted, every few years we have some odd people. Horace Greeley tops them all and lost election. So a lot of the liberal Republicans came back to St. Louis and joined the Republican Party again, but Joseph Pulitzer found he couldn't. Remember how principled he is. He felt his principles were more important than anything else, and he became a Democrat, reluctantly at first, and later a very fervent Democrat. In 1878, he gets married after being a lawyer for a while. He still doesn't know what he wants to do. He has $300 left from a series of very successful business deals. He brings his young bride back to St. Louis, and he does something rather unusual. On the steps of the courthouse, the same courthouse where the Dred Scott decision was made, he buys a bankrupt newspaper called the St. Louis Dispatch. It was one of 3 afternoon papers that were being published back then and made no money. And I can't imagine what Kate Pulitzer's reaction was when he came home and said, yes, I spent my last dollars, our last dollars, buying a newspaper that's bankrupt and no one buys. But this is where Joseph Pulitzer's genius lay. Unlike Edison and other people who created something new, Pulitzer had this uncanny ability, much like de Tocqueville. Notice de Tocqueville was a foreigner who saw things about us that Americans didn't see, and we still read de Tocqueville today for that reason. Pulitzer saw changes happening in American society that Americans didn't notice. And what were these changes? Farmers were leaving the farm and coming to St. Louis to become workers. Thus, they were becoming commuters. Women who had made economic decisions on the farm were now making a different set of decisions. Where to buy gingham, where to buy flour. They needed that kind of information. Very different than the farm life. The telegram, which was the Victorian internet, was invented, bringing news as fresh as that morning from the nation's capital, St. Louis. Paper was being made out of wood with tensile strength that meant it could go through printing presses at enormous speed. Richard Hoe was creating the printing presses that could produce these newspapers at enormous speed. Gaslight was becoming electric light so you could read into the evening. Pulitzer put all these ingredients together and began creating a newspaper that had that morning's news. Think about it, an afternoon paper you could sell for commuters heading home that had morning news from the state capital and the U.S. Capitol, meaning that people who read the morning papers were literally reading day-old news. And there are lots of other things he did. Commuters had something to read on the way home. With advertising, women had notions of where to buy things. And in this one stroke, he was creating a newspaper that had a reason to be popular and also economically independent. Because once he created a newspaper with readers who bought it, as opposed to the Missouri Democrat and Missouri Republican, which you took out of obligation, he could have advertisers and you could be economically independent. So while his paper was Democrat, in the sense it supported Democrat, it could criticize party bosses because it didn't owe anything to them. The paper was so successful, he immediately bought another one, the Evening Star, and he sells off its parts, much like a rag salesman. And soon his paper was an enormous success. And it was called Western-style journalism. Now, what was meant by that? Pulitzer loved Dickens, and he saw in Dickens that the man was making money writing stories, of course, completely made up, but about the drama of urban life. Poverty, death, anguish, love, all of these things. Well, why not in a newspaper using the real material? A murder trial doesn't just become a murder trial, it is a story. He admonished his reporters to write engaging stories in short sentences that anyone could read. He also learned how to use scandal to his advantage. In St. Louis at that time, if you were wealthy, you were supposed to file a tax form every year, listing what was in your checking account, listing how many horses you owned, how stables were like, and file it with the county. And believe it or not, these records were to be public. You could go in and look at them. Joseph Pulitzer did that. He discovered most of these people left blanks. The richest people in town claimed to have no money in their checking account. So all he did was publish it in his paper. Then he sent out his reporters to interview people about their reaction to it. And of course, they would say, reaction to what? And the reporters say, the Post-Dispatch has published the story. So they'd quickly go buy the paper, be quoted in it, and then buy the next day's paper to see how they were quoted. So he was using news not only to create a new form of journalism, but to gather readers. So he became vastly successful. People around the country were talking about him. But St. Louis, frankly, ain't New York. New York City was, at that point, in many respects, the capital of the United States. The capital of banking, the capital of culture, the capital of publishing. Yeah, those folks in Washington occasionally passed a law, but Washington you didn't want to live in. I mean, who would go to Washington at that time? New York was the place to be, and that's where he wanted to be. So he came to New York, and he bought the New York World, which was accidentally owned by Jay Gould. a robber baron who Pulitzer attacked all the time in his paper in St. Louis. But Gould had bought it accidentally in the sense in buying up a bunch of assets he'd got in the paper. He didn't care for it. It wasn't making any money. So once again, Pulitzer was buying a dying paper and bringing with it the formula that he had perfected in St. Louis. I like to think of it as, you know how Broadway plays are played away from New York before they come to New York? This is what he was doing. He was testing out his journalism. Not some master plan, but that's the way it worked. Now, what was so interesting is newspapers were boring. This is what the New York World looked like when he bought it. All the headlines were the same size. The stories would read very often as if they were written as a letter. It would be titled, "Letter from London." "The fog has lifted and the Queen has been seen about," would begin this long, boring story. And at the end, oh, by the way, the Crimean War came to an end. And so Pulitzer immediately began to break open the paper. Big headlines, cartoons. This is a visual difference that is as striking to people in the 19th century as your ability to open up Google on your phone today and see things. Those boring gray ladies were becoming printed in color with this kind of graphic action going on in it. Oh, it's a lot more. And you know, a lot of people don't know those papers were in color. Remember when USA was opened up in 1981 and it made this big deal? USA Today said, we're in color? Historians were thinking, yeah, sure you are, 100 years after everybody else. But they didn't know that because all these papers were preserved in microfilm and libraries threw out the color ones because who wanted to keep paper around? There's a set that still exists at Duke University. And of course, the greatest invention, bar none, of the 19th century was the Sunday comics. And all of this paper rested on something interesting that many people know about because Walt Disney brought a movie to make a fortune as a Broadway play, the Newsies. These are the real Newsies, the street urchins that sold papers. What was different about the papers back then, remember there's no other means of getting news. There's no radio or television. The newspapers published a morning edition, but they published an evening edition. And the evening edition began to be published every hour after 9 in the morning. So if you were an attorney in town and you wanted to know what was going on in a trial, you'd leave your office, give one of these kids a penny, and you'd get the count of a trial that's going on that day, and you come back and buy another one. These kids, in turn, would yell out the headline. Being mostly illiterate and not very educated, they couldn't handle a word like xenophobic or, financial markets. So headlines were written not only to accommodate the tabloids, but to accommodate these kids, which is why the New York Post and the Daily News still have those short headlines. That's a bit of tabloid history that's still with us. And I don't want to spoil it entirely, but if you see the Newsies or seen the movie version, The Kids Win, read my book. So anyway, the New York World became very, very successful, and here he is stealing all the advertisement from Jim Bennett and Dana and the other newspaper moguls of that time. It was so successful that Pulitzer again found himself leading in this cartoon, the New York State to vote for Cleveland, electing the first Democrat to the White House since before the Civil War. The difference that year was New York voted Democrat. The difference was Joseph Pulitzer's world. And he gets swept into office as well. He becomes a member of the House of Representatives. His name had been on the ballot. He went down to Washington, heard the debate on the floor, and said, God, this is boring. And he quit. Now, this may not be a big deal, but it is a big deal. He needed to read the Constitution a little more. That meant his district had no representation for 2 years, and these kids who wanted to go to West Point had no one to write a letter for them. But anyway, he might share the feeling about Congress today. Who knows? So now Joseph Pulitzer is publishing a newspaper of immense importance that is changing American landscape, and is changing it in a very dramatic way. Pulitzer looked to the Lower East Side, being an immigrant, and saw the teeming masses of immigrants coming in, not as a threat. Remember, the other newspaper owners are part of that Upper Fifth Avenue group who began to worry about all these Jews and Italians and other people coming into the Lower East Side. And the Lower East Side was the most densely populated place in the world, and a horror show. Jacob Riis wrote a story called The Human Rain, in which kids and parents would go up on the roofs of the tenement buildings on hot summer nights in order to find air to breathe. and some children would roll off the roof to their death. No one was paying attention to this. Pulitzer admonished his reporters to go and write about these people. And a magical moment occurred. There's a dignity brought to life when your life is in print. I mean, this is a hypothetical, so don't panic, but if you were to invite me to your home tonight, on your refrigerator is likely to be a clipping held by a magnet. Your son or daughter's sports achievement, an obituary, a wedding announcement. Why do we cherish these? Because print has this enormous power to provide dignity to our lives. So when he began to cover these people's lives, they too felt like they mattered. They were in the same newspaper that had the names of the Astors and the famous 400 families in New York. And they also found in the newspaper something for them. On Sunday, you could buy the New York World almost as thick as a telephone book that included easily readable stories about what was going on, stories about them, economic news that mattered, how to use a U.S. bank, how to get ahead, dress patterns you could cut out. And a century before our children began downloading music and thinking, oh, we're really cool, these folks were downloading music. Why, it had sheet music of the most popular tunes that week, and you go home and play it. That's how adventuresome and exciting the New York World was. And he got rewarded by their allegiance, but how did he cover them? Well, he covered them in the same way by admonishing his reporters to bring drama. So if somebody died and there was a murder, there's no question they didn't make that up, but they could write it in a sensationalistic way where the child sat in a puddle of blood looking at the dead corpse of their father, or when the woman hacked up her husband and put his body in barrels, we could have diagrams of the various barrels, head in here, body in here. The sensationalistic journalism got the name yellow journalism. And it came, I'm being a little anachronistic, it comes a little later when William Randolph Hearst also has a yellow comic strip featuring the yellow kid. And so those papers began to be called the yellow papers. And so those folks I mentioned on the upper parts of Fifth Avenue who drank their tea with the little finger up, they would open up the world and say, oh, this is such sensationalistic prattle, how dare he do this? They were missing the point. Because when the world covered these stories, the folks in those tenements downtown or in the black and tan bars were saying these are the stories that mattered. They cared about O'Shaughnessy's kid being beaten up by the police. They didn't care who went to the ball the night before. And so the paper delivered to them, and they delivered to Pulitzer money by buying the paper. And the paper grew and became so influential on the pennies of these folks. This leads me to the next story. The French people had kindly built this statue. Now, keep in mind, not the French government. French people were giving it to us as a present of friendship. And the pedestal was being built in New York. Surprisingly now, because the statue has become so important to us, they were failing to find enough money to build the pedestal. Congress certainly wasn't going to interfere because, again, the conditions were we were supposed to raise the money privately. Boston was saying, well, wait a second, why isn't it in our harbor? And some New Yorkers were saying, well, I don't know if we want it in our harbor. A big statue of some woman with a, it didn't have the power it has today. So Joseph Pulitzer decided that in order for this to happen, he needed to do something. So he wrote a front-page story in his paper about the scandal of the money not being supplied, so all we had was the pedestal under construction. And he said to folks, bring in your pennies, your nickels, and your dimes, and we'll put it in a fund. Now keep in mind, Pulitzer could have written a check for the last $100,000. At this point, money was not an issue. But he wasn't going to do that. So people every day came into the paper, and they would leave a penny or nickel or dime. These are some of the poorest New Yorkers, and they would inscribe their name for having done so. And a day or two later, their name would appear in the paper. Now notice I say a day or two later, because Pulitzer, ever the journalistic genius, knew if he published the name the next day, they'd buy the paper and that'd be it. If you publish a name 2 or 3 days later, you're going to keep buying the paper until you see a name. But again, that relationship, and I don't mean to badmouth any financial corporation, but if one of the major financial corporations in the U.S. called you up and said, would you stop by our office and leave some change on the desk? And don't worry, we'll guard it and give it to them. We want a 501c3. We want accounting. That's the kind of trust these folks had in Joseph Pulitzer to come in and leave their nickels and dimes. And that's, in fact, what happened. And the pedestal was erected. Now Pulitzer is one of the wealthiest people in the United States. His newspaper is so successful it needs a new home. Remember I told you to remember about Park Row? This is Park Row. This is the park where Pulitzer joined the Civil War Union troops. And right over here, outside the picture, is French's hotel that kicked him out. Well, revenge is a dish best served cold. He bought French's hotel and tore it down and said, that's where I'm going to build my new building. And boy, did he build a building. This was the tallest building on the globe at this point. And the editorial offices were occupied under this golden dome looking out over all of New York City. And the building was really a big deal because Park Row was a big deal. See, at that point, if you wanted to know who, let's say it's November now, how are you going to find out who won? You're going to turn on CNN and NPR, something like that. Only way you're going to find out who won back then without waiting for the newspapers, go down to Park Row, where they inscribed all the headlines of what was happening. So they would have the results state by state. Notice all the hats people wore back then. So people by the thousands would gather there. It was a great place to bring a date, frankly. For instance, there was a boxing match in Manila, and the results were being telegraphed, and they had two marionettes to mimic the boxers. And when it was over, the crowd was insistent that they do it again. A century before ABC Wide World of Sports instant replay in the 19th century. Building a building on Park Row was a big deal. Not only did it dominate the landscape of New York, but it represented enormous achievement in the Fourth Estate. And it was a media event. Now Pulitzer is having the cornerstone laid. This is Joseph Pulitzer Jr. Joseph Pulitzer wasn't going to come to this because at this point he was suffering from detached retinas and going blind. Think of it as like Beethoven's deafness. Joseph Pulitzer could no longer read the newspaper he had created. Secondly, blindness in the 19th century before Helen Keller was a disease that had such social stigma, people who were blind not only could not see, but did not want to be seen. They became recluses. And so Pulitzer was not going to show up for the laying of the cornerstone. But the cornerstone was laid by his son, and in the cornerstone was this box, which we now have dented. Because in 1955, when they tore down the building and looked for the cornerstone, they couldn't find it. But finally, a clamshell, one of those things breaking open a stone by accident, out it fell. Here's a group of men at Columbia University opening up the contents of the box. What was extraordinary in the box were photographs and all that kind of stuff, but also a wax cylinder recording. This is very shortly after wax cylinder recordings had been created. And I'm bringing to you in a second a recording that may be the 10th oldest recording of the human voice, maybe 11th because they've discovered a new one. And what it is they consider this moment a media event. They didn't use the word media back then, but that kind of thing. And so these reporters went into a closed room and recorded their voices, put it in the box for posterity. Now, keep in mind, have you ever handed a tape recorder to your child? You know they don't know what to do. Well, these reporters are trying to fill the thing. So in a second, I'm going to play it, and I have a transcript so you can make out what they're saying. But think of this. You're experiencing a century and a half old voice. It's like a telephone call from the past.
The New York Baseball Club has just won the league championship. Hurrah for the New York Baseball Club. This year, 1889, has been a wonderful year for disasters. The first of the year, the Brooklyn gas works blew up, and the great cyclone we had blew down the bridge, the suspension bridge at Niagara Falls. Later in the summer, we had a great flood at Johnstown, and the whole city was swept away. And also in China and Japan, they've had great floods, and a great landslide in Quebec, Ontario. No, not Ontario. It was in the city of Quebec, in Canada. Chicago wants to get the World's Fair in 1892, but she won't get it because New York is going to get there just the same. The transatlantic steamship, the City of New York, is the fastest boat now on record. She makes the trip in less than 6 days. Edison has just won his lamp suit from the Pittsburgh court, or rather from the Westinghouse Company. Yours truly, A.W. Rose.
Now, two things you should notice, and I can tell you as a former reporter is true. What happens when two reporters get together? Talk about disasters, because it makes good copy. And what do reporters always wrong about? Predicting the future. Did the 1892 fair go to New York? No, it obviously went to Chicago. So if your candidate doesn't look good in the press, don't trust the press. They have no idea what's going on. Ooh, sorry. So anyway, there's the building, and I want to reconstruct for you a quick scenario before we finish up the story of the significance. Pulitzer at this point has remade the American landscape when it comes to journalism. He didn't invent it. Other people were doing the same thing, but think of him as the Picasso of the Cubist movement. He is the leading proponent of creating independent, economically independent newspapers that fearlessly report the news and become an important part of democracy, a valued part of democracy. And so he's remade the media landscape, but he's also remade the New York landscape with his building. So an immigrant is arriving in New York by ship, and they go by the Statue of Liberty. And maybe in this age of cynicism, and I get this when I talk to younger crowds, they don't understand the significance. These are folks who've left the steppes of Russia, who've left Poland, who've left all these places with their last few dollars, staking their hope on the future life in the United States. There's no Delta discount flight back home to see Mama next year. Probably the last time you'll ever see your family. And so with anxiousness, you look out over the ship, you're sick from being on this voyage, and there's the Statue of Liberty. Am I doing something wrong? Sorry. Okay. There's the Statue of Liberty that they see. It may be rising out of the mist. And then they turn their eyes. Sorry, we're going to just wait 1 second. Sorry about that. Okay. Sorry. So anyway, so they're back to turning their eyes to New York City, to see the city that will be their gateway. Even if they're going to Oklahoma, they're going to go through New York City. And if the conditions are just right, the sun is gleaming off that dome and catching their eye. So the first thing they'll see in the new world, the world that they're staking their future on, is a monument not to commerce, not to banking, not to farming, but to the media, specifically to the newspaper that will become their gateway to becoming Americans. That, to me, is one of the big transformative moments in Pulitzer's life. Unfortunately, things were not going to get to be much fun for him at this moment. William Randolph Hearst arrives in New York, using his mother's checkbook, buys the New York Journal. New York Journal was a newspaper that people forget was started by Albert Pulitzer, Joseph Pulitzer's younger brother, whom he was not very fond of. So keep that in mind when this rivalry occurs. So William Randolph Hearst is trying to out-Pulitzer Pulitzer. He's trying to do all the kinds of things that Pulitzer does, but to a greater degree in sensationalism. And falls into his hands the perfect opportunity. The battleship Maine is blown up in the harbor in Havana, leading to calls for war. And you began to see these kinds of things. No one knows why the ship was blown up, but we should go to war right away. In the New York Journal, crisis at hand, Spanish treachery, and most Americans know the story of how the press really fanned the flames of war. I mean, wait till you see this next illustration. Look at this. I mean, can you imagine this in the press today? All is lost, Spain's sunset, etc. And Congress does declare war on Spain. Now, if you open up a high school history textbook, you will learn always Joseph Pulitzer's world and William Randolph Hearst's journal led and fanned the flames of war. Well, first historians have discovered it didn't make that much difference. We went to war for other reasons, right or wrong. And as you know, the war worked out very nicely for us. We won it quickly, and it was our first sort of international intervention. But what's unfair about referring to Joseph Pulitzer's war, because the two newspapers at that point were engaged in outrageous sensationalistic behavior, making up stories, printing those graphics you saw. In fact, they were stealing from each other, so the New York Journal published a story about some colonel who had died, Philip Razunit. And then the World picked up the story wholesale, and the next day the Journal pointed out that it was an anagram for "We pilfer the news." So they were both engaged in highly irresponsible journalism, and the moniker yellow journalist was hung around Pulitzer's neck as it was hung around William Randolph Hearst's neck. And both men knew that they would go to the grave being known as yellow journalists. It's not entirely fair to my guy. My guy's daughter, Lucille, who's pictured here, had died in December of 1897. She was his favorite child because she did what he asked. His other children didn't care anything about what he asked, but she was the docile, perfect daughter for this temperamental man. This man was so self-centered that even when she was suffering from ill health and was upstairs, and the whole house on Fifth Avenue was in turmoil, he got up at one point and yelled, "Hey, I'm the one suffering here. Why doesn't anyone pay attention to me?" This is according to one of his butlers who thankfully wrote to his sister in Ireland, so we have this account. And Pulitzer was also very eccentric at this point. You know, I told you about his eyesight. Well, it manifested itself in other forms of anxiety to the point that he lived on his yacht. He would go across the ocean, turn around, and come back. His yacht was specially built because he hated sound of any sort. So he lived as this incredible recluse. I mean, the accounts, you can find them in my book of, like, the yacht was built with, well, no, actually, before he got his yacht, on the White Star Line, they had special Pulitzer doors that they would install when he was on board that were thicker. They put sisal mats on the deck above so you wouldn't hear footsteps, and they shut down the piano bar at a certain hour. If you had lunch with Pulitzer and you ate your celery in a crunchy manner, you'd get a memo saying, "Mr. Pulitzer enjoyed having lunch with you, but no crunch crunch next time." He was the Howard Hughes of the 19th century. Anyway, his daughter that he loved had died, and so where did Pulitzer go? He came down here. Here's his house across the way. I'm sorry, I should use the term cottage across the way. And he came basically depressed and hid out here in Jekyll Island and around here while his staff was conducting the conduct of the newspaper back in New York. Now, so keep in mind, these editors in New York feared that if they lost this circulation war, the greatest circulation war of newspapers, they would lose their jobs, but there'd be no place to go. So they were willing to do anything that William Randolph Hearst's soldiers were willing to do in the absence of their general. When Pulitzer regained sense and came back to New York, he put an end to this in a very famous memo that he sent to his staff and resumed the more responsible stature of the New York World. So it's just a little footnote in history. Next time anyone tells you this, and you're from this area, say, "No, I can tell you the true story. Pulitzer was not running the paper at that point. It's not his crime to be a yellow journalist in the Spanish-American War." But things aren't over yet. Before I get to the final story, understand, how did a blind man actually run a newspaper at this point? He did it by hiring a retinue of male servants, or, well, I shouldn't call them associates, that stayed with him all the time, and they would read the paper and books to him aloud in a very special way. When they read the newspaper, they would use newspaper jargon. And a 48-point headline across 2 columns, the story begins, photograph right hand, notched, all the kinds of terms. And then he would dictate back to them instructions, like never use this word, never say these kinds of things. In fact, at one point, there was a story about a very prominent woman in New York City who had redone her nursery in anticipation of giving birth to a child. And the New York World had this beautiful spread of photographs of the nursery and comments about the nursery and how excited they all were. Pulitzer had this story read to him, and he sent a telegram back to New York saying, "Under no circumstances should a story like this appear in the paper. In fact, the reporter who wrote it should be fired. I want to know who that was." There were no bylines back then. And I'm going to tell you how these telegrams got there. You'll find how complicated it is. Remember I mentioned the telegrams of the Victorian internet? It's as unsafe as the internet. If you're J.P. Morgan and you're in London and you send back instructions, buy X stock, by the time your telegram has been read by every telegraph operator across the world, that stock has doubled in value. So everyone wrote coded telegrams. You could buy a code book. Pulitzer was so consumed with this, he created his own code book. And if one copy had not survived and not been at Columbia University, most of my book could not have been written because all of his telegrams were written in code. So these editors would get these telegrams, open them up, unlock their code book from their desk drawer, translate them, and here were these telegrams saying, "Fire this reporter, find out who it is." And they wrote back and said, "There's nothing wrong with the story. Even my daughter liked the story." What was wrong with the story, from as far as Pulitzer was concerned, is it implied that the woman was pregnant. Upper-class women who became pregnant back then hid from society because if you're pregnant, now if I'm shocking you, we can open up the doors, that meant you'd had sex. It's a very different world back then. So that's what upset Pulitzer. So he kept pushing them to find who had written the story. Turned out to be a freelancer named Zona Gale, and she was summarily fired. There's a nice ending to the story. Zona Gale became a playwright and became one of the first women to win a Pulitzer Prize after his death. So that's the day Joseph Pulitzer fired a Pulitzer Prize winner. So let me get you to the end story of his life. This man becomes the next pest in his life. Theodore Roosevelt is the first media candidate we ever had. When he went charging up the hill in San Juan, who did he make sure came with him? Reporters, the press. Even the New York World had to cover him in these glamorous ways. So when he became president, he was outraged because the New York World published an editorial alleging that when Theodore Roosevelt pulled off his most important act, the acquisition of Panama and the Panama Canal, millions of dollars had flowed to France that no one could account for. Now, the reason for this money going there is the French investors held bonds on the construction equipment that was in Panama. But there was no accounting, and the world suggested that maybe there was a little bit of corruption in this wonderful thing. Well, Roosevelt was so upset about it, he wrote to the U.S. Attorney in New York and the U.S. Attorney in Washington and said, I want this man, who now looks like this, blind and infirm, to be indicted and sent to jail for something called criminal libel. Henry Stimson, a very young attorney out of Yale, whose name may seem familiar to us, he later becomes Secretary of War, Secretary of State under other administrations, is just becoming an attorney, U.S. attorney, and just starting out. He writes back, Dear Mr. President, I'm paraphrasing, mind you, I've looked, but there isn't a law called criminal libel exists in the United States. You can't just go around indicting people for laws that don't exist. And Roosevelt, well, that's okay, we'll find somebody else. And he found a grand jury in Washington that did his bidding and indicted him. Pulitzer won, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's not the most significant case, but it's a moment, again, where this independent, economically independent press also is able to stand up to government. So sometimes today, and this is in conjunction with the Pulitzer Prize, when a small paper in a small town dares report on stuff about the town council and things like that, a lot of this is coming from what happened in that time period. And the New York World building was so clearly a symbol to the entire nation, not just to New York. Notice this cartoon just uses the building. Cartoons use elements that we all know. And that shows how important the New York World had become to the United States. So at the end of his life, he survived the threat of Theodore Roosevelt. He survived William Randolph Hearst's assault on him. This is perhaps the last photograph of taking him alive. We believe it's in southern France. That's his son Herbert, one of his daughters. And as he was beginning to make plans to be remembered, as many of us do, well, maybe not to be remembered, but as we figure out what to do with our money when we're heading off to the next world, he decided to do two things with his money. One is to create the journalism school that you see here, the building at Columbia University, and the other is the Pulitzer Prize. And he had a number of motivations. I like to think that they were three. The first motivation was, you remember this thing about yellow journalism? He saw himself, much the way Sherlock Holmes ends his life, wrapped in the arms of Moriarty, going to his death over the cliff. He thinks he's going to be remembered in history as the yellow journalist along with William Randolph Hearst, and he doesn't think that's a fair rap. So what do? You endow a school of professionalism in journalism and a prize in your name, and that helps clean up the record. There's a deeper significance. Pulitzer had entered journalism as a failed politician. In those days, if you were a successful politician, you went on. If you failed, you became an editor. And if you succeeded as an editor, you became a politician. There was a permeable cloth between the two. And he left the legislature and all that and went into journalism. So he used journalism first as a tool of power to advance himself and his reform ideas. But over time, he came to realize something. Much like many of us, when we're given a weight of responsibility, we change. Pulitzer came to see that journalism in American society performed an incredibly important function. Unless the citizenry is equipped with independently gathered material, how can we exercise our vote, our franchise? Now, you may have a dismal view of the press today when you talk about that, But this was a lighting the dark recesses of our society back then, what he was doing. So by creating a professional school where journalists could be trained for this weighty responsibility was an altruistic goal. But the third goal was, you remember his daughter? And kids walking into the journalism school never notice this. When I've spoken there, I've said, what is in the front hall of the journalism school? It's engraved in memory of his daughter, Lucille. So those would be the three motives. Joseph Pulitzer started life as an immigrant to the United States and changed America. We could change his name to 1,000 others. This happens all the time. But what's different about Joseph Pulitzer and other 19th century people is that we can identify what the others done, and most people don't really remember Joseph Pulitzer's contribution to American society except for the prize that bears his name. And so what I'm hoping that you gather from this is that Joseph Pulitzer's effect on our society is still with us today. It's almost like his hand is reaching out from the grave and reminding us of things. And so in many ways, if we fault the press today, some ways to bring them up is to bring them back to their origins and show the kind of work that the journalists did back then. I mean, one of the most powerful elements of journalism, which was certainly, and he was an example of, is merely lighting the dark recesses of society is a change maker. You don't have to advocate, you don't have to have the kind of violent words conversations that go on television now where people yell at each other. You can change the agenda for the better with simple, honest, factual reporting. And in many ways, that's the legacy of Pulitzer that I think he hopes his prize continues, because the most important prize of the prizes he created was the one for public service. The notion of giving a prize to a newspaper for public service might seem anachronistic today, but what it does is it provides an extraordinarily important lever of support. Watch when the Nobel Peace Prize. It's often given to dissidents who face possible loss of their lives in their home countries, but once they get the Nobel Peace Prize, no despot's going to kill them. I mean, they know the press consequences. Well, so when a small paper risks everything to write about something that's going on in a community, and they lose the support of merchants, lose the support of the city, when they get that prize, it provides them the same kind of recognition and protection. It doesn't matter if the New York Times and Washington Post get prizes. It has no effect to them except for their advertisements. You know, winner of 20 Pulitzer Prize. But that magical moment when the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service is given to a small paper, that's what Pulitzer had intended for the prize, and it represents the kind of good journalism that in many ways we've lost sight of. I've taken up 52 minutes of your time. I apologize, but you know, we writers get excited about our topics. Do you want me to take a few questions before we break up? So I'll be glad to take some questions, but thank you for being so patient with me. Again, a moment my father would have been amazed. They applauded for you, Jamie? Anyway, some questions? Yes? I can give you a little bit of an answer, not a full answer. It's a very well-run organization in which books and newspapers submit their material. It's not, they don't just go looking for it. So for $50, you or your publisher can send in your book or your play. It might be $70 now, it was $50 a while ago. Newspapers put together a section of articles. And if you're a careful newspaper reader, sometimes you read a series in a paper and you go, I know why they're writing that series. It's going to be a good nomination for the Pulitzer Prize. Keep in mind, they're not being nominated. And if you ever read somebody's comments that says, I was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, what they really meant is somebody sent in your material. And the Pulitzer website explains that you're not nominated. So then they're read by groups of very able people. In the case of biography, they have a group of biographers who read these biographies and mark them and score them. And ultimately, a list of maybe 4 books is sent up to the final committee, a list of 4 feature articles, etc. All of these things are winnowed down by other people. The Pulitzer Prize Committee then votes on who should be awarded. Now this, I don't want to get in trouble with them, but this might be the Achilles heel of the thing. Because most of these people have not read the books. they're good on the journalism because that's their business. Most of them haven't seen the play or heard the piece of music. They're using these recommendations, and that's when other things get to play. They may know the book because it got a lot of good reviews, etc., but they make the final determination. And sometimes they play around a little bit. I may be wrong, but this year, let's see, the T.J. Stiles got an award in history, even though he'd been in biography. They moved him over. And I'm not belittling TJ's win. I mean, he's a friend of mine. I'm just saying that they can change things at that point because they think this work is meritorious, but they also think another work is meritorious, so they shuffle the deck a little bit. And then the person's life is changed, because what you say to somebody who's won the Pulitzer Prize is you say to them, now we all know the first words of your obituary. The Pulitzer Prize winning so-and-so died yesterday. But there's a very good book by... God, without my notes, James Bolin, I think, about the history of the prize, how it was developed, and he's updated it to tell you about how the process goes on. And in defense of them, it's very transparent. I mean, their website explains it all. There was somebody over here somewhere. Yes. I opened up a paper in Ireland where I was, and they were publishing the results of this national test they give to kids. Unlike here, there are these barrier tests, and the results are released all in the same day. So all these kids are having ulcers because if you don't do well in the test, you're shunted off to vocational school. And one of the feature stories was about two young girls who had come to Ireland 2 years before not speaking a word of English and had scored tops on the test. Pulitzer is a bright fellow, and learning English was an important economic reason. Now, the Westlake Post offered him employment in German, but to succeed, he had to learn English. So he went to something called the Mercantile Library in St. Louis. In the 1870s, single men who were clerks, reporters, whatever business, lived often in boarding houses. So that meant they had one little room to go home to at night, and that's kind of dull. So they went out in the evening, and their choice was a bar or a house of ill repute. And business people didn't think this was very healthy. So in New York and in St. Louis and a few other cities, they created libraries. This is not Carnegie libraries, not public libraries, but a membership library for $1 you could join. And it'd be a place to go and read newspapers, to get self-educated. A very famous group of Hegelian philosophers met in the St. Louis Library. So it was a place that, in the Mercantile Library, it was a place like that where Pulitzer could go, and there's stories of him going up to people and saying, can I practice my English with you? And he'd sit in the library and talk. So there was not everybody learned English as successfully as he did. But it's really not that uncommon. I mean, if you ever read Allende's novels, I mean, a lot of people master another language, but it does reflect he had enormous intelligence and skill. Yes, sir. It was, but I didn't get it. But I've noticed a side effect. All my friends joked about how I wrote the book so I could have the name Pulitzer and my name on the front cover. And I'm probably going to get in trouble with my new publishing house, but I noticed on the next book that's coming out, I've written other books, but it says, by James Morris, author of Pulitzer. And I'm wondering if there's not a little subliminal attempt there to try to link it. No biography of Pulitzer has won a Pulitzer Prize. Swanberg, who wrote the last one, got a Pulitzer Prize for his book on Norman Thomas, but not for the Pulitzer Prize. It's a little bit like the Vatican in the sense that you're waiting for white smoke, and occasionally years later, you hear little stories about how things. But should I take one more, Mimi? Yeah. Joseph Pulitzer was a failed father. He was so self-centered and had so many psychological problems that I think he wounded his children severely. And I've gotten to know descendants. I think you can almost say genetically some of the wounding was passed on. A number of them have suffered from problems. Joseph Pulitzer, his son, was the one who could have been the great journalist and ended up being a great journalist. But because he was the black sheep of the family, for instance, when he was at St. Mark's, he went into town to get a little liquor, and when he came back up, he crawled on the ivy up to his room to the window. At least he thought it was his room. When he tumbled in, he discovered he was in the principal's bedroom with the principal's wife. He got thrown out, and he wouldn't do what his dad wanted him to do, so he was banished to Siberia, which is, as far as Pulitzer was concerned, was St. Louis. And they ended up running the St. Louis Post-Dispatch to enormous success years after his father had died. The paper that Pulitzer so loved in New York, he left to his two sons, who had no interest in journalism, and the paper became bankrupt in 1931 and no longer exists. What people don't remember is, and if you do any research, and everyone rushes to the microfilm to read the New York Times because it's such a dominant paper, it wasn't a dominant paper back then. It was struggling, and the World was the dominant paper. So Ralph and Herbert and others, lived off the money they had, and they did engage in a number of things. The next generation went into journalism. The Joseph Pulitzer III became a journalist, and I knew him as a reporter in Jeff City. One of the things that happened to me is I was a reporter in Jefferson City, the same place that Joseph Pulitzer was a reporter. See, when he was a legislator, he didn't give up his job as reporting. Copy was great. This young, brash elected official from St. Louis wants to reform, written by himself. And he became a very successful journalist, but then the family decided he shouldn't take over the business, so he left journalism. He passed away a couple years ago as a young man. And the Pulitzer family sold their newspapers and television stations in about 2005 or 4, I think, for a vast sum of money to Lee Enterprises, who struggled to keep the papers going, and it's no longer the same. And then there are other Pulitzers that are connected by marriage. I mean, I'll confess I owned Lily Pulitzer jeans once in my life. And there's a set of twins who haven't always conducted themselves well in the public eye. And there are other Pulitzer descendants. I run into them every once in a while. I'll tell you this, and they won't be offended. Like many people, the descendants don't always know a lot about their family. I have more conversations with, for instance, his being a Jew. Succeeding generations were unaware of that. Even though when Joseph Pulitzer Jr. went to boarding school, he was taunted with anti-Semitic terms, and he went home to his mother and he said, why am I being called this? And of course the mother whipped out the line, well, there are many good people who are Jewish, including your father. Joseph Pulitzer kind of joined the Episcopal Church. His children were raised as Episcopalians. And so they lost that. And even accounts as recent, before my book came out, even the website of the Pulitzer Prize didn't refer to his ethnic origins because it was in doubt, and no one had really. So, one of the things you learn as a reporter, and I'll land here, my first editor told me, it's an admonition, it's really useful, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. So I use the same process with anything. And so when I interview people and the family tells me things, it's not disrespectful to them, but we often don't really know things about our parents and our grandparents. And one last thing. Emily Rao Pulitzer, who is the widow of Joseph Pulitzer III, and is a famous person in the art world, and I became close to her because she helped me obtain documents and stuff. I sent her an inventory of the mansion in New York, which is right almost at the corner of Fifth Avenue. And she wrote me back excitedly. She said I'd solved a great problem in her life. And the reason was every time she decorated her house, her husband insisted the carpets be red. And she couldn't figure out where this came from. Turns out the first Pulitzer had red carpets in the house everywhere. And even though he'd never seen it, you remember what I'm saying about genetic things being passed on? She was so excited. She said this inventory solved a puzzle I'd had about my husband all these years, red carpets. Thank you very much for your time.